Welcome back to A Bit Gaming and a video on the history of medieval eras and armour. It's not going to be entirely accurate because I don't think there is an entirely accurate way of discussing this, but this is how I divide the Dark Ages and Middle Ages into eras by the armour type available at the time. So starting at the beginning, or the end, depending on your point of view, the end of the Roman Empire. And chainmail was the kind of standard sort of armour. A chainmail shirt sort of ish, sort of covering the shoulders, body, down through the groin, but not long sleeved or long legged. And the drop from Roman classical the classical era to the Dark Ages, it didn't really affect armour that much. It didn't really go backwards. The quantity of how much you could make really went backwards, but the technology itself didn't, because chainmail had been invented long before by the Celts. So that's the baseline. That's the kind of classical era armour that as you go into the Dark Ages. As you go from the early Dark Ages with the chain shirt, you get into a bit what I call the later Dark Ages, which has got where you've got what's called a hauberk, which is a chainmail that goes down the sleeves to the wrists and down the leg tight to the knees, maybe with a steel helmet on top. And as I say, this is what I call late Dark Ages. The labelling is kind of is randomish in a way, because the Dark Ages aren't really a clear-cut period that's the same everywhere, or rather it's the same period but has different dates. So for example, places like Britain was in the Dark Ages from say 400 until the Norman conquest, and the late Dark Ages in the last 100 years or so, whereas France had probably gone into the late Dark Ages in like a couple of hundred years earlier, around the 800s or whatever. And places like Byzantium never really had a Dark Age. They just went on from the classical into this kind of thing with what you might call this hauberk type. It's just an improvement on chainmail where you could make it so that it was just longer, basically covered more area. And there's a slight aside just on the question of these kite shields, and why they had the kite shields. I think it's personally, this is just my personal guess, that it was related to the Dane axes. People using a long double-handed axe, you've got a standard circular shield, and it deflect this large axe with a circular shield is there's a chance that it's going to swing down and take your foot off. So I think that's why kite shields were developed. It was purely a reaction to the Dane axes. And so as Dane axes dropped out of favour, people dropped having the kite shields. And this is the what again I'd call late Dark Ages. An example of Normans in various places. Fighting for or against the Byzantines, and again you've got the same thing. You've got this longer hauberk, from the chain shirt or things like that, or there's other versions of it like scale or whatever. But again, you've got the same general principle that it's got longer, and you've got some kind of open-faced steel helmet on top, and that's kind of I say this is like to my mind, it's like on the verge between late Dark Ages and early medieval. And this leads you to the classic Norman knight. He's got armoured, from the knee up, more or less. Kite shield, spear, lance, whatever you want to call it. Open-faced helmet, and so that's the on the edge of late feudal and early medieval. Now this is what I'd call proper early medieval. Well, this is just my way of marking them out in my head, what the different eras are, different periods. And early medieval for me is the mailed knight, where you've got mail covering the whole body. You know, you got leggings underneath the long chain coat, and the chain goes all the way to your hands and over the head, and you've got a closed helmet on the top. So that's basically how I define early medieval. And you can't always tell what's underneath, because around this time period they start wearing all these surcoats on top. So you know, the fact that they're covered in mail but no plate at this point is, apart from the helmet, is often covered up by the surcoat, or jupon, I think it's called. Could be wrong on that. The next era, generally called high medieval, when it's at its peak, and is how I kind of define it in my head, is what I call plate mail. That's probably not the accurate word for it, but I think it's a good way of reminding yourself what you're talking about. Which in my case, you got the chainmail as before, you know, fully covered in chainmail, but then again bits of plate across regions which aren't that important for movement or don't interfere with movement, like a breastplate, for example, or shin guards. You know, so you got these, you know, chunks of plate over the top of chainmail. That's, you know, I call that plate mail, for reasons of keeping it clear in my head. But that's the distinction. It's chainmail like the mailed knights, but with chunks of plate over certain areas. You know, it's sort of bits easier to make, and don't interfere with movement. So yeah, so here's some other examples. There's you've got someone in chainmail but with plate covering various parts, not completely covered in it, but you know, got it on the shins and on the chest, etc. Just for that, you know, added protection on various spots. And the third medieval era is full plate, or what I call full plate, where a knight, you know, you've got the chainmail underneath, but you know, pretty much everywhere in the front is covered in plate, and there's a few little gaps like under the arms, or the elbows, on the inside of the elbows and knees, where it's still just chain, because you need it for articulation, for moving around, but generally covered in plate armour. And a good example over here on the left is a mounted crossbowman. He's like, you know, a sergeant basically, and at this point, you know, the knight's got full plate, and the sergeant has got the old kind of what I'd call plate mail, you know, chainmail underneath with bits of plate on the top. And then lastly, what I call Gothic, which is just the full plate that's been you know, improved to the limit of its ability. You know, it's lightweight, very easy to move in. You know, got all sorts of improvements to maximise protection. It's just like taken to its final form, just in time to be made pointless by pikes and guns. So the gist is, there's this you know, steady evolution of armour from the kind of late feudal era through early medieval, high medieval, and then late medieval, and into the early Renaissance. And you know, it's really a kind of a gradual, smooth evolution over time, but disjointed, because it's, you know, this evolution takes place faster in some places and slower in others. So there's no real, you can't really say that the armour in 1300 was like X, because it'll be like X in one place and Y in another place and Z in another place. But for purely kind of conceptual, or rather that's kind of why, for getting a conceptual impression of what it is. That's how I work it. You know, late feudal is like the Normans from the Bayeux Tapestry. You know, hauberk, and open face helmet. Early medieval is the mailed knights, you know, covered in chainmail with a closed helmet. High medieval is plate mail, which is chained with bits of plate on it. And then late medieval is full plate, full plate, and Gothic is fancy plate. That's how I kind of you know, remember it in my head, basically. Yeah, so that's just how I, you know, choose to remember it in my head. And if you've ever played medieval Total War, for example, they have that kind of those 3 sets in the game. You have mailed knights, the early ones, and then the feudal knights, and then the chivalric knights. They're the kind of the 3 grades. So according to this schema, I'd call the Norman Conquest late feudal. The next bit, kind of like Barons' War sort of thing, or earlier kind of civil wars and fighting in Britain and stuff like that. Be late feudal to early medieval. Barons' War, maybe early medieval. 100 Years' War, early to high medieval, and Wars of the Roses as high to late. That's just how I kind of I can kind of vaguely remember how these different periods sort of span out by basically classifying them according to the best armour that the knights would have at the time. And that brings us to the main point of this, which is in terms of wargaming and units and all that kind of stuff, which is the best armour at the time is the highest status armour. It's knights and above. So if you're looking at these periods, these eras, like say early, high, and late medieval, and you look at the different kind of categories of people involved in the fighting, the knights would be category 1. Then below them you've got the sergeants. Sergeants originally meant veteran, and they gradually got associated with a military rank by the veterans. The sergeants being, if a knight had a load of archers from his estate, he'd probably have one of his sergeants be in charge of the archers, for example. But anyway, so the first category you've got knights. Second category is sergeants. Third, I'm calling infantry, which are kind of infantry again comes from a French word for infant, basically green recruits. So these are kind of like levy troops. And then the fourth category being peasants. And the way I kind of think about this whole medieval thing is, each grade down in status gets 1 grade less in armour. So, for example, in the early medieval, where the knights, you've got mailed knights, then the sergeants would have padded type armour, and the infantry, the levies, and the peasants don't have anything at all. In the next era, in the high medieval period, you've got the knights in plate mail. You might have the sergeants in chain. See, it's like 1 grade down, and then the infantry or levies in padded armour, and the peasants in nothing. And then the high medieval period, we've got the knights in plate. You get your sergeants in plate mail. Often, they'll generally count as men at arms at this point. So infantry in chain, and peasants still in nothing, or maybe padded. But yeah, so that's a general kind of way I kind of I keep it straight in my head between the 3 periods: mailed knights, early medieval; plate mail, high medieval; and plate being late medieval. And the ranks below them all having 1 grade less of armour than the previous era. And just for completeness, is an example of padded armour or quilted armour, which is again, these are lots of cloth whacked together, and that's what a knight would wear below their chainmail. That's the other kind of aspect to it, is that a knight's armour was layers. You got padded armour or some kind of gambeson, chain, and then the plate on top. So if you're 1 rank below, you might just have the padded and the chain, and then one rank below that, then you've got your padded armour. And say the importance of that, well, one is it's useful if you're kind of trying to figure out units and stuff like that, and what figures to buy for a particular army or whatever. But there's another, I think, important reason which will I'll come to in the next video.